Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, and I think Jamie Soden is still alive, but we don't hear him lately, so I don't know if he went somewhere, but he's on the call, we just don't hear him. But anyway, our topic for this podcast is, I guess, about people falsely accusing you of things, and how do you deal with it when people are saying things that are false about you and wrong about you? Because I think this is something we all have to deal with. We have to deal with conflicts with people and arguments, and even though we who understand that free will is an illusion, we're able to not blame each other the way free will believers do. Often other people are blaming us. They are accusing us. They are mean and hostile. And we need to figure out what's the right way to approach people because oh, I see Jamie sent a message. My mic is acting up. I'm leaving for tonight. I'm tired. You can mention my arguments in this podcast. I don't mind. Stay on topic. I trust you people. You're intelligent and you demand evidence like wise people. Thanks. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Um, George, see, when we have a conflict with somebody, um, whether they're accusing us of something, like accusing us of doing something wrong and blaming us and punishing us for it, for example, well, how do we deal with the situation in a practical way? Because obviously there's no time to get into the whole philosophical thing of why they should not be attributing free will to you and blaming you. But how do you handle that in a practical manner?
And Chandler, I think this is very important because people, are often afraid that if we abandon the belief in free will, not only will our civilization collapse, but we won't be able to like negotiate these kinds of situations. So let's frame it in a bit more detail. Basically, what Jamie told me is that he had asked a friend of his daughter what it's like to be a girl. An innocuous question, somebody online misinterpreted, and Jamie didn't say what they were accusing Jamie of at all, but basically they were going on the attack. So the first thing that comes to mind with situations like this is like, ideally, just like even with free will belief, ideally, you want to kind of like be civil and try to negotiate things in the best of ways, as peacefully as possible. Again, this applies to both free will belief and non-free will belief. But I think in both cases, when a person aggresses against us, I mean, we have this principle of self-defense, and we usually view it in terms of physical self-defense. If a person is assaulting us physically, it's our right to defend ourselves, which means we have to fight back. It's the right thing to do. And so I think that sets the precedent or principle for cases like this also. If we're trying to be reasonable with a person, even though we're not blaming them because we know that they don't have a free will, we know that they're compelled to blame us and accuse us, we may nonetheless have to, at a certain point, if civility isn't working, go on the attack, as a means of emotional, psychological self-defense against, I mean, fine, we don't have a free will, but we have feelings. If the person is hurting our feelings, then we need to defend ourselves against that.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is I've been realizing this more in my life, and I've had to defriend some people, on social media and stuff because they want to fight and they want to argue about stuff. And now that's actually though, I mean, it's been difficult for me to get to that point because my tendency has been to try to reason with them and explain, well, no, this is not true because of this. And, people accuse me of being evil and sinful and persecuting them and all sorts of strange stuff like that happens. But what worries me is how will I be able to handle this in real face-to-face conversation? Not that it happens very often, but this is difficult because I can't go on the offensive, and especially if it's your family members, like your parents or other people you live with, or it's your bosses at your job. Like, it's difficult. It's almost like in a lot of situations, you kind of just have to let them think they're right and take the punishment. And that's been my approach.
All right, well, I mean, if it's a person in authority, like sometimes a parent and a boss, yeah, that seems reasonable. I think many of us, have to do that, or we're in those certain, it seems like the reasonable, not the ideal thing, but it makes a lot of sense. So certainly in situations like that, then, but let's say it's someone, let's say online, that you really don't, there's no disparity in power between you. And I think, like, to the extent, because we may like not like to simply argue because that's our nature. And I think sometimes when that's the case, I think we have to get better, not at attacking, but actually at distancing ourselves before, it gets to that. In other words, like, we might reach the conclusion that, through no fault of their own, because they don't have a free will, they may not be very intelligent, or they may be holding just beliefs that are erroneous, and we, are very unlikely to disavow them of their beliefs. So I think sometimes it just makes the best sense to recognize that and simply remove oneself from those interactions. Saying, listen, we're going to just have to agree to disagree, and, just like completely shift to something else.
Yeah, I think it has to be done because there comes a time when the conversation is not productive, and there's absolutely nothing that you could say that resolves the conflict. So a lot of times it's best if people leave the discussion and cool off.
Right. All right. So now, so let's get back to, like, what you raised before. Let's say it's your boss or your parent, where you basically kind of like, they're saying something, you disagree. And see, I think what we're dealing with in situations like that, we're conditioned to feel bad about that. We feel emotionally bad. Somebody's saying something, we know they're wrong, but they need for us to accept what they're saying, whatever. And so I think what we need to do, Chandler, is like, we need to get better at understanding the implications of that no one has a free will. I mean, we understand this intellectually, but I think we also have to understand it strongly enough and deeply enough so we integrate it into our emotional selves. So basically, when things like that happen, we could say to ourselves, well, like, fine, it'd be nice if this wasn't happening, because I think we all are conditioned to prefer agreement to disagreement. But to the extent we get better and better at reminding ourselves that these people who are insisting we believe something, when we know it's wrong, don't have a free will, then I think that would greatly, perhaps completely, lessen our tendency to become angry with them, or even to become angry over what they say. In other words, we still might be angry at whatever is causing them to say it, but I think it might make things better. But again, I think my main point is, yeah, we have to work on that. We have to work on not just understanding that free will is an illusion, but on how to use this understanding more and more in our daily interactions.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because I understand they don't have a free will and that there's some reason why the conflict is happening, even when it's just wrong, even when the person's wrong, or even maybe we're wrong and we don't know it. But yeah, it's interesting because it's important when we get emotional, when we get heated, when voices are raised and there's chaos going on, to not let our emotional tendencies to, react irrationally. That's my difficulty, is because when I get emotional and I feel threatened, I kind of, I kind of turn into the whole fight or flight response. And neither way that I act when I get like that is the way that is the right way to act. And I know that.
Well, I mean, let me give an example of how I dealt with something. It was actually yesterday, the day before. I was on the phone with somebody who believes in free will and they have to believe in free will. And that's what I discovered. At first, it was kind of like an exploration, and I kept explaining to them why free will is impossible. And they, were saying, well, but, each objection they raised, I successfully addressed. And then, it seemed that that wasn't working. So then what they did was they began to interrupt me a lot as I was explaining things. And it got to a certain point where I just like said, well, this is wrong. And I wouldn't allow them to interrupt me. So each time they tried to interrupt me, I kept talking, and they got angry because this person happens to be a bit of a control freak, whatever. But anyway, it got to the point where it was a conflict, and I felt good. I actually felt good about not letting this person have their way because they were wrong. Again, this is a bit different from what we were describing in terms of a person who has authority over you, and I think maybe we should get back to that because that's important. But in this case, again, yeah, I would have rather that we didn't, um, that it didn't come to that. But there's peace is a value. We certainly value peace and civility and getting along. But dignity is also a value. In other words, like to the extent that we sometimes allow people to mow over us, to have this unfair, unethical control over us, you know, for the sake of peace, and we lose dignity over that, I'm not sure that's a good thing. I think the basic dignity and just defending what's right is something that becomes important.
Yeah. And one thing that's interesting is that being aware of times, the difference between when there's some authority figure, whether it's your boss or the police or whatever, where you just basically have to do what they say and pretend as though they're right. There's a difference between that situation and other peers who don't really have any authority over you, and you don't have to take mistreatment from them. And it's knowing that difference that I need to work on.
Yeah, Chandler, I mean, is there an instance that you might want to relate with either, your parent or a boss that demonstrates that you can say like, that, they believe they're right in certain whatever, and you feel they're wrong, but you have to do what they, say because they are in a position of authority. Is there, a specific instance that you might want to relate that we can maybe explore in more detail?
Yeah, well, that obviously happened in the Navy, in Navy boot camp, the short time I was there. Basically, the only way to stop getting constantly yelled at, and sometimes that didn't even work, was just do whatever you're told. There was no way I could, even though I was being mistreated by the officers who were yelling at me and calling me a piece of worthless shit and that sort of stuff. Oh, sorry. I guess we're not supposed to use that
No,
word.
no, that's all right. In
But yeah,
context, it makes,
I'm
yeah.
but yeah, but that's just the kind of stuff that they were saying to me, and they were doing it not just to me but everyone, and so it was kind of an abuse that all the recruits had to take, and it's still damaging, I think, to take that, and yet there was nothing that could have been done differently. Of course, we know we never could have done otherwise, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, all right. I haven't explored that, but let's actually explore that within the context of free will, in that, like, what you said was that, like, they were treating everyone that way. In other words, that must be the policy of the military in boot camp. They must believe that it benefits a person in some way to be subject to that abuse. Otherwise, I don't think they would, they would exercise that. So from that perspective, I think, relative to this whole thing of free will, we can understand that it wasn't personal, right? That the person wasn't, attacking you and the other people out of any kind of like personal, reason. It was simply policy. Um, so let's see. Now, I mean, like with something like that, when you understand, like let's say you were in that same situation now that you've had, several months of just like understanding that absolutely nothing is up to anyone. Would that make any difference in that kind of situation?
It actually would, George, because see, back at that time, that was years ago, and I thought that I really was to blame for all kinds of things that they picked on me about, like that I couldn't tie my shoes fast enough and that sort of thing. Because back then I believed in free will and I wondered why I couldn't be perfect enough. But now that I understand that I was doing the best I can, you know, I don't blame myself. I know I don't have a free will, and I'm not responsible in the way, so it can't sting as bad as it did at that time.
Yeah, and I think their approach may be to instill in soldiers the same kind of attitude that we're trying to instill in civilians through understanding that no one has a free will. What I mean is like what we teach people is like when somebody is abusive toward us in some way, and we can remind ourselves that it's not them, they are completely compelled to do what they do, then all of a sudden it's not personal and it takes a lot of the sting out of it. We can say we may not be pleased with what's happening, but we may not direct our anger toward them or feel that that it's significant or meaningful in a certain personal way. So like so from what you're saying, I think what why they may do that is maybe to instill in these soldiers, like for example, they nobody likes to feel bad, right? And I think so like what happens with these soldiers is like they get some of that abuse and they say, well, there's no way they can like, give it back to their drill sergeant or something. That's not going to work. So basically, they say they have to accept it, and all of a sudden, it just becomes meaningless. In other words, like it flows in one ear and out the other, and they just like say, "Hey, this is it doesn't mean anything." So I'm wondering if that's the purpose to allow people. We have this expression, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That I think that might be, the purpose to help soldiers see what happens, what other people do, as not having the power to hurt them. To help those soldiers develop that. How's that sound?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's a good explanation. Maybe that's it. It's kind of interesting because it's true that eventually somebody would get to a point where it doesn't mean that much to them. They're used to it. And I think that's sort of, in a way, it's sort of like a workout, where somebody's stretching their limits, getting their muscles stronger. In a way, I think it works that way, where they get a little bit tougher to where they're not as deeply emotionally affected all the time because they build up a resistance, perhaps.
Right, but in Chandler, I think we have to though make a distinction. 'Cause in the military, maybe there are other things that these soldiers are made to do that fosters a very strong sense of self-esteem in them. Because again, not having free will, we know that a lot of times what we hear about us, what we hear toward us, our reaction from the world, forms a great part of who we are. And so I can think of examples, for example, where a parent or an older sibling or something might be telling us, hurtful things, and we're not, especially maybe young kids are not able to just let it glide off their skin or back, whatever. Basically, that a lot of times the way people are treated in that way is harmful. So I think actually, so this is actually why it's so important, I think, for the society, for people to understand that no one has a free will. because all of a sudden, like, for example, let's say, a young child has a parent who's like, telling them, you're worthless, whatever, some parents just will do that. And to the extent the child understands that that parent doesn't have a free will and is able to not quote unquote blame the parent, then it might help the child to be able to negotiate. Because, like, I think that the immediate response in a situation like that might be the child becomes fearful and the child becomes resentful of the parent, and so then there's not maybe enough interaction going on. So, like, to the extent I think that maybe in situations like that there's this understanding that nothing actually, and this, we have to go the full circle on this. In other words, like, to the extent that the father or the mother or the parent or the older brother or sister understood that the younger child doesn't have a free will, then I think the actual basis for that kind of abuse would evaporate. So like we're basically we're on, our mission is basically to transform the very nature of how we interact with each other to basically minimize or perhaps even eliminate this kind of abusive behavior toward each other.
Yeah, and actually, George, that's even more important because, little children, especially, they don't have the understanding that we have because of we've studied this for so long and then understand that nothing's up to us because it takes a little bit of time to really get the concept into your whole psychology. And so children don't have that as a way of helping them not take it personally when their family members or other people treat them badly. But what you're saying is that this will actually help those other people not blame these children and say these awful things and punish them for choosing to do this and that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, for example, let's say it's a teacher and, the teacher's student is, let's say it's a math class or something, and the student isn't getting it. Now, I think this is actually an example of how we understand that we don't have a free will. Because a lot of times in this example, a math teacher, if they're a good math teacher, they will recognize that we are born with different aptitudes. Somebody who might be brilliant in music and in art and in something else, whatever, might be very weak in math. So basically, they understand that, and so that kind of prevents them from really like blaming, a student for not being able to understand, or just like accusing them of not trying hard enough and all.
And George, that's a perfect example because that's exactly what my mom told me happened to her. Is her math teachers in school were blaming her for not being talented at math. And a lot of times that's the case. They blame people being for not coming out of the womb knowing everything about the subject that they're supposedly going to teach them about.
Yeah, and Chandler, I mean, we know from our experience with these professional academics who have PhDs, we know that somebody can be, like, for example, intelligent enough to get a PhD and to teach, classes in college, and yet be pretty weak in terms of basic logic and actually, not being able to understand why free will is so impossible. So I think this is something that, we in our experience see. And yeah, so like Chandler, yeah, we're basically, creating a world where this kind of like, ignorant, unintelligent abuse of people, and even sometimes of ourselves, because we blame ourselves, just becomes much, much less prevalent.
Yeah, and George, this leads me to an interesting thought. I've been thinking about something lately because you know how I theorize about if I had children, how I would raise them, what I would say to them, and I think about this often. And what I think would be helpful is that while there isn't very much I can do about the fact that people would say horrible things that damage their self-esteem, what I can do is I can counter that and I can explain to them why it's not their fault and that these people are irrationally blaming them for things. And I think that will actually help them.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And again, we're at the leading edge of this. And again, one of our challenges is to overcome the emotional bias that people have toward accepting this. People like to believe that things are up to us. And so that's one reason why we might present an argument to them and they won't understand it because their emotions hijack their reasoning. So if we can present more and more examples of this, of how, like, this free will belief and how this belief makes us act, actually just like makes things so much more difficult for parents and children, for siblings, for friends, for married couples. That to the extent we overcome this belief in free will, we can have so much of a more harmonious world. I think people will then, be able to like, at least, be able to see their biases and hopefully overcome them.
Yes, and it's interesting the fact that we get so hijacked by our emotions and we don't see what's true because we have a need to believe certain things. I mean, that right there is one more explanation for why we don't have a free will and that we need to believe certain things because some people they derive their whole meaning in life from the fact that they are controlling their life. To them it's a fact. So to us we know it's not a fact, but that's what they say. Well, that their whole meaning in life comes from being in control. And it's interesting to me because it seems that those people who have a need to be in control, to need to feel like they're in control, those are the people who aren't going to get it.
And you're right, and you're right, and this, so like, there's basic. I've got to do. You just reminded me. I have a book titled "The Republican Brain" by this guy called Chris Mooney. And he's quick to mention it's not just something the Republicans do; Democrats do also, conservatives and liberals. Basically, he cites a lot of research that shows instances where people believe what they believe politically or ideologically or whatever, religiously, not based on reason, but based on these emotional needs. So, Chandler, I think to the extent we understand this process better, and I'm glad, this reminded me. I'm going to actually, start, reading that book again to get a better understanding. If we can understand the mechanism of how, these emotions trump their reason, then maybe we can address it in a way that will overcome it, that will reprogram people. Hold on for just a second, Chandler. Nick, I'll be right down, right? Okay, thanks. Sorry. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Chandler. Go ahead.
Okay, where were we?
We're at 28 minutes and 20 seconds, so we're almost, we might want to wrap up. I mean,
Yeah, I suppose so. We've talked a lot about this stuff, how we cannot take when knowing that we aren't to blame for anything, we don't take it as hard when people are blaming us. And I think it takes time to do this, but this can prevent us from our self-esteem from getting as damaged as it often does with people.
yeah, and
Um,
Chandler, yeah, a good thought is we might want to come up with exercises that help people do this, even ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Something that we can do to remind ourselves not to punish and blame ourselves, which sometimes it's still a bad habit. It's hard to break.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to work on that. So I guess I'll close this podcast. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, and, well, we didn't have Jamie on. Something went wrong with his mic, but I'm sure you'll hear him in future episodes. Bye bye.